Welcome to the podcast, The 1773 Boston Tea Party Explained. After the French and Indian War between Great Britain and France, which ended in 1763, the British began imposing new taxes on the American colonists to pay for the large debt they had incurred defending the colonists against the French. The colonists felt that they were unfairly taxed because they didn't have any representation in the British Parliament. Starting with the Stamp Act in 1765, tensions started to build as the colonists resented the unfair treatment they were experiencing from the British government. In 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, which granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sold in the American colonies. This was an attempt for the British to bail out their state-sponsored British East India Company. Due to unforeseen problems in the Far East, the East India Company had 17 million pounds of surplus tea in their warehouses. Under the Tea Act, the government would allow the surplus tea to be sold directly in America through a handful of selected dealers. This tea would still carry the despised 3 pence per pound tax. The cheap tea price would allow the British tea merchants to undercut their colonial competitors, most of whom sold smuggled Dutch tea, which was not subject to a tax. To force the Americans to buy tea, the British authorities clamped down on the smuggling of tea into the colonies. This high-handed policy enraged small merchants, which were left out of the tea trade. In most of the other colonies, the surplus tea was either stored or sent back to England, but not in Boston. In New England, one of the most outspoken critics of the tea was the Patriot leader Samuel Adams, who was a member of the Sons of Liberty. Arrival of the 3 ships into Boston Harbor that were laden with the surplus tea sparked riots among the citizens. The British tea merchants were harassed mercilessly until they had to take refuge in a British fort in Boston Harbor. At a meeting of the Sons of Liberty on December 13, 1773, they decided that the tea must not be unloaded, nor could it remain on board 20 days, and thus be seized for sale by customs officials. The British Loyalist governor, Thomas Hutchinson, whose sons were among the tea agents, refused to issue clearance papers to allow the tea to be returned to England. Things came to a head on the night of December 16th at a Boston town meeting led by Samuel Adams. The crowd grew increasingly agitated, and by late that evening, Indian war whoops could be heard in the street. A group of townsmen and the Sons of Liberty dressed themselves as Indians and marched down to the dock where the 3 tea ships were moored. A crowd poured out of the meeting hall and followed the colonists dressed as Indians to the dock. Over 100 men boarded the ships and began to dump 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. Despite the pandemonium of the night, the men were conscientious. They didn't damage the ships or other cargo. After 3 hours of frantic work, they had thrown about 18,000 pounds of tea into the sea. This act of open rebellion infuriated the British, except for one man, a barber named Francis Eckley, who had been caught bragging about the participation in the Tea Party. The authorities found no one else to hold responsible. The British sought retaliation against the citizens of Boston for the act of disobedience. The furious King George III wrote in an address to Parliament, the colonists must either submit or triumph. The British government could not allow this open rebellion against their authority and pushed through Parliament a harsh set of laws called the Coercive Acts in April 1774. The Coercive Acts were designed to punish Boston and the colony of Massachusetts for the insurrection. One of the most damaging acts was the closure of Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea could be paid for. Boston Harbor was the main port of entry for goods and foodstuffs for the city. The lack of the import and export commerce and food paralyzed the city and added to the festering resentment of the citizens against the British. In addition to shutting the port, the British also altered the colony's charter and put the city under military occupation led by General Thomas Gage. The Coercive Acts meant to make an example out of Boston to other colonies. Instead, it galvanized the colonial resistance, which ultimately would lead to the American Revolutionary War. I hope you enjoyed this podcast about the Boston Tea Party. If you want to know more about the American Revolutionary period, I have included some links in the description. Please don't forget to give the podcast a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and thank you for listening.